So I'd like to introduce a project that I've been working on for the past year called the Housatonic River from Sea to Source. So as you can guess, this project involves going upriver, up the Housatonic in a boat from Long Island Sound to roughly central Massachusetts. About 80 miles as the crow flies, but more like 120 miles or so when you factor in all the bends and oxbows of the river. It's also a pretty difficult project because the river starts as an estuary, but eventually it ends up as a fairly shallow river with class 1 and 2 and 3 rapids. There's a lot of shallow areas that are only a few inches deep. There's also portages, so I would need to find a boat that would work in all these conditions, which is not something that's readily available. Also, to my knowledge, the river has never been boated in this manner before. I've never heard of anyone boating upstream the entire length of the Housatonic. I know that people have canoed downstream from source to sea. Even in the late 1800s, there were people that were doing this recreationally. But to my knowledge, nobody has ever boated up the entire length of the Housatonic, so I think that would be a really fun project to accomplish. But really the main goal of this project is to learn about the history and the early settlement of the Housatonic region. And to me, it just makes a lot more sense to explore the river in the same fashion that it was settled, and that's from Long Island Sound up north. So we have a great goal of learning about the history of the settlement of the Housatonic River region and attempting to boat the entire length of the Housatonic going upstream. So the big question is, why would I want to do this? Why would I want to go against the current on the river and learn about this very obscure piece of history? For me, the fascination with this very early part of American history started when I was in high school, and in roughly 1998 or so, a Dutch fort was discovered in Branford, right on Long Island Sound, and it was found by someone who was scouring old maps drawn by a past president of Yale College named Ezra Stiles. So he used these maps to locate this previously unknown Dutch fort. And this discovery just captured my imagination. The fact that there were multiple different European nations settling on this continent that were all at one point or another at war with each other and claiming overlapping territories is just fascinating. And in addition to that, you have the history of the Native Americans and their interaction with these different European settlers and traders. So this region to me is a fascinating area because you have an overlap of Dutch and English claims to this land in the early 1600s. The second reason is I want to learn how to go up wild rivers with rapids that can't be explored in any other manner. I've tried poling canoes up the Housatonic. There has to be some sort of boat out there that could accomplish all these goals, being able to go up rapids, being light enough to portage, and having a shallow enough draft to go in only inches of water. My goal is to find the right boat that will work in all these situations. So this is a little bit of a learning curve, and since the Housatonic is local to me, I have plenty of opportunities to try out different boats and see what works. And I could use that knowledge to explore other rivers that might be in much more remote and wild locations. So the next big question is how? How are we going to do this? So as far as the research goes, there's plenty of publicly available online resources like digitized maps from the early 1600s, English and Dutch maps on the Library of Congress. There's lots of digitized archives that I can scroll through to look for information, even Ezra Stiles maps of the Housatonic that I can study to look for clues and find places that I want to investigate. There's also publicly available LiDAR maps that I can study to look for man-made anomalies like foundations to buildings that are right on the banks of the Housatonic that I can access with my boat. So probably the biggest question mark is the boat. How are we going to do this? The Housatonic was never really like the Connecticut River where larger ships could sail up far inland. So I needed to find a modern solution to go up the river. I finally settled on an inflatable boat. First I tried a Zodiac type boat, 10 foot, using a propeller driven outboard. That was out. The propeller was way too vulnerable. It broke on rocks. Did not work for the shallow section of the river at all. So I started looking at a jet drive outboard This allowed the boat to go in much more shallow water because there's no propeller to brake on rocks. There's simply an intake that hangs down in the water and an impeller that sucks water into a volute and shoots it out the back, creating thrust, allowing the boat to be propelled along at a similar speed as a propeller-driven outboard. So this was certainly the right type of outboard. The problem is that a small outboard using this jet drive is not available. Modern engines that are fairly lightweight can be adapted to a jet, but unfortunately the jet kits were back-ordered, so I ordered a kit for a lightweight Suzuki, but in the meantime I had to find an old motor that I could rebuild, which I found sitting in a barn and simply rebuilt it to the best of my ability. I also realized that the Zodiac type boat with the keel wasn't the best solution, and I went to a much narrower boat called a Kaboat, which is a kayak slash boat hybrid. It has larger tubes than the previous boat, so 18-inch tubes, so it has the same size tubes as a very large Zodiac, but there's only enough space to sit one person in between those tubes, and it's fairly long and narrow like a kayak, which would make it easy to portage on very narrow trails. And they're also light, they're under 100 pounds, which is important. So I had a 100-pound outboard, 100-pound boat, roughly 30 pounds per gas tank, which I needed 2 gas tanks, and to top it all off, I added some wheels to the transom of the boat so we can simply roll the boat around rough terrain, and if we have to, take the outboard off and carry it. So let's get into some of the footage from the trip. So I'm going to break up the video in 2 parts. First part will be from Long Island Sound, roughly up to Kent, and the second part will be from Kent all the way up to Great Barrington. In this video, we'll talk about the first part, the early history of the river. So first of all, there are Native American artifacts dating back 10,000 years found along the river. The first European to see the river was the Dutch explorer Adrian Block. And this was in 1614. He had just built a ship in New Amsterdam, probably one of the first ships ever built in the New World. And he sailed it up Long Island Sound and came to the estuary of the Housatonic, which he named Rivier van der Rodenberg, meaning River of the Red Hills. And he may have sailed into the estuary, but certainly did not go very far. So to see what this part of the river looks like where it enters Long Island Sound, it's probably best to view it from the air. So I was taking some flying lessons, and of course I wanted to fly over the Housatonic. So here's some footage flying over the Housatonic where it meets Long Island Sound, and you can see this would have been the same place that Adrian Block came up from New Amsterdam and named this river. So now let's check out some footage from the river. So this is the Housatonic River estuary. After Adrian Block, it's likely that Dutch traders sailed up the Housatonic and established a trading post, but the Dutch never settled here. It would have just been a place to trade. The first settlers along the banks of the Housatonic would have been the English. So in this area that I'm boating now, we have the towns of Stratford on the west and Milford on the east. And these towns were both settled in 1639. But what brought the English out here to establish these towns? Well, just a couple years earlier in 1637, there was a military operation that basically involved the English chasing a band of Pequots westward across the state, which culminated in the Great Swamp Fight in what is today the town of Fairfield. And the English ended up winning the day, and this is really what brought them out to this frontier land. So in 1639, you have these 2 towns founded, and just to set the scene, these were Puritan settlers. They were staunchly religious. You have in 1651 a witch trial in Stratford where a woman was executed as a witch. In 1641, in the town of New Haven, there was actually a case of a pig-human hybrid being sired by a New Haven man. Both the man and the pig were put to death because in the Bible it says that if a person was to sire an offspring with a quadruped, both the man and the beast would be executed. So they were following the Bible to the T, and there was a lot of fear of the Dutch, fear of the Native Americans. You have a very staunchly Puritan settlement at the mouth of the Housatonic. And you can see the boat is doing good, but it's really not made for these waves. There's no keel on this boat, so it doesn't have the ability to cut through the waves. It just kind of bobs on the surface like a cork, so you can see it's throwing us around a little bit. It's not exactly the best type of boat for this, but it's doing well. It's getting the job done. We're still going upstream here. You can see we're passing Sikorsky, where they build the helicopters. On the left, we went under the Merritt Parkway, and we're heading up towards Derby. So we've reached the Naugatuck River, and I did make an attempt at going up the Naugatuck a little bit, but I might come back and try that another time. So at this point of land here, where the Housatonic and Naugatuck meet, two Englishmen, Goodyear and Wakeman, set up a trading post in 1642. And believe it or not, Wakeman and Goodyear were actually involved in the pig-human hybrid case back in New Haven. You can't even make this stuff up. Wakeman was a planter, and he revealed the pig-human hybrid to Goodyear, who was a magistrate. This was probably the same location that the Dutch were using to trade, because in 1646, the governor of New Amsterdam sent a very passive-aggressive letter written in Latin to the governor of New Haven. And it basically said, you're on our land, that you're disturbing our trade, and that you need to leave the region of the Mauritius River, essentially what they called the Hudson. You need to leave this land. The English governor of the colony of New Haven responded, also in Latin, with a letter that said, we have no idea what you're talking about with this Mauritius River. We've never heard of that. This is the Pagusset, and we have the right to trade with the Native Americans, as do you. The colony of Connecticut, the colony of Massachusetts. Keep in mind, the New Haven colony was a separate colony from the Connecticut colony at this time, and they sent this letter back. They set up a trading post in 1642, but it wasn't until 1655 that 5 families came up here and settled this point of land, what they called Pagusset at the time, but would later become the town of Derby. So other than Derby, there wasn't too much activity in the mid-1600s here on the river. So the Native Americans still had a strong presence on the river, and there was actually a Native American fort built on the bank of the Housatonic in Shelton. Basically the area that we're passing by right now, there was a fort located right there, and you can see that on an old map. So it's very useful to reference these maps when going upriver so we can find these historic sites. So moving north, we pass Shelton, where the Native American fort was located. We passed Oxford, and here we are on the border of Newtown and Southbury, and here's some really nice drone footage of the boat going up this section of the river. And I'm heading up to the Pomperaug River. The next area to be settled was what is today the town of Woodbury. So in 1673, a group of 15 families purchased a parcel of land from the Native Americans off this Pomperaug River. They were following the directions to get to this valley that they had just purchased, and they went up where you see me boating now, and I reached a dead end where it got too shallow, and they actually came to the exact same conclusion, and they turned around and they headed back onto the Housatonic, which is what I'm doing now. They went farther up the Housatonic to the Chepaug River, and with much difficulty, they actually ascended Roxbury Falls and made it into the wilderness of what is today Roxbury. You can see I actually parked the boat on the Chepaug here, and I'm actually hiking up along these falls, and these are really impressive. But the 15 families started hiking inland from here. Miraculously, they found the valley that they had purchased. So I do want to take a second to talk about the LiDAR maps that I've been accessing as I've been going upriver. And here in this area, there's 2 really great examples of LiDAR anomalies. The first one turned out to be the foundation of a very old farmhouse and involved boating up the Chepaug and hiking a good bit inland to find this foundation. The other example is a Native American rock shelter. So this is just a little south from the Chepaug and on the right bank of the Housatonic. And you can see this was probably a hunting camp where the Native Americans would have sheltered and maybe napped some quartz projectile points. You can see using LiDAR, I was able to find these 2 excellent examples of human habitation that I certainly wouldn't be able to find if I was just aimlessly exploring. So by this time, the Dutch were no longer a threat. The English had taken over the colony of New Netherland in 1664. But of course, there were still Dutch settlers that were pushing into the region from the Hudson River. They were culturally still Dutch, but they had sworn in allegiance to the King of England, so they were no longer really a military threat to the English. So I'm going north, up Lake Lilanona, which is a lake formed by a dam on the Housatonic River. So the river here would have been, of course, much more shallow, but because of the dam, I'm now essentially on a lake, and I'm reaching the point in New Milford where Goodyear's Island was, where the trading post was set up in 1644. But there's no island to be seen. There's a small island, which is called Goodyear Island on the map, but this is really just a piece of land that was cut off when the dam went in and flooded this area. Goodyear's Island is underwater. I was really hoping to be able to explore the original Goodyear Island when the water level is dropped in the fall to work on the dam, but unfortunately I checked it out and no island had risen from the water. So Goodyear Island is still just out of reach, just under the water here. And I actually do have a 1934 aerial photo showing Goodyear Island before the dam went in. So in this gorge where I'm easily boating through here, before the dam went in, would have been extreme rapids and like a 8-foot drop with some waterfalls. And now I can easily boat through here, so that's one plus of the dam. Just on the top of these bluffs on the right side of the river was the Native American village of Housatonic. And this was a major Native American site. The cliffs on the other side today are called Lover's Leap, and there's a legend that a Native American woman, to commit suicide, went over the falls that are now underwater here, and just as she went over the falls, she saw her white lover on this cliffside here that's now called Lover's Leap, and he jumped in after her, and they both died in the rapids right here where I'm boating now. So, as I mentioned before, up on the cliffs on this right side of the river was Housatonic and the palace of Chief Warramog, basically a elaborate longhouse that was 100 feet long, that was said to be painted on the inside, and really must have been a sight to see coming up river here. But just past here, there's a tributary to the Housatonic called the Still River, and it was in 1685 that a town was founded along the Still River that was called Swampfield, and later the name was changed to Danbury. So essentially we have the towns of Stratford, Milford, Derby, Woodbury, and then Swampfield, what was later called Danbury. So going upstream, I came to the Bleachery Dam, and here I had to portage around.
Not too bad.
And a little farther up, I soon came to the center of New Milford. So New Milford was really first settled in 1705 and was founded as a town in 1712. So as you can guess from the name, the original settlers and proprietors were from Milford. So I'm going up through the center of New Milford now. To my left would have been a 1-mile wide cornfield that the Native Americans would have been cultivating, and on top of the hill beyond the cornfield was Fort Hill, and there was another large Native American settlement there. So this is a really interesting juxtaposition of a Native American village built atop the hill. On the other side of the river, you have the English settlement in Town Hill, what was then a swamp, with kind of crude cabins built around this swamp, and that would later become the New Milford Green. Really interesting history as we're going up the Housatonic here, but things are actually getting a lot more interesting here from a more technical boating standpoint, because the river is now getting a little bit more swift and shallow. And you can see this was my first attempt in a propeller-driven Zodiac.
All right, this is as far as I can go. I'm gonna turn around here and head back down. The riffles are just too strong.
Didn't make it very far, didn't have enough horsepower, the prop would hit. So we made another attempt in the early spring of 2022 with a little bit longer inflatable boat with a 12 horsepower outboard with a prop. The first one I was using was only 6 horsepower. Made it pretty far, but when we got to the Gaylordsville Bridge, we knew that we wouldn't be able to make it through these rapids. We barely made it this far as it is. On my next attempt, I had the 25 horsepower jet outboard, and I was ready to take on this stretch of the river. So I powered up the Housatonic, paralleling River Road, made it through all the riffles and the shallow spots, came right up to the Gaylorsville Bridge Rapids, circled it once, checked it out, came around, powered through the rapids under the bridge. Fortunately, I don't have footage of that. Here's some footage of me going back down where there's a little 1-foot drop. But I kept going. I went up past the next set of fairly difficult rapids. But I eventually came up to a point where there was a sluice-like feature where the rapids were being channeled into one very strong channel. I circled it. The boat didn't feel quite good, so I came around and I lined the boat up through a small channel on the left side of the river.
I made it all the way up past the impassable rapids with small gray boat. It's, I don't know, this, I'm not sure.
So took the gas tanks out, pulled the boat through. Here's some footage of pulling it back downstream. I don't have good footage pulling it up, but this kind of shows how this was done. So I left one gas tank behind, and I continued upstream. Kind of powered through some shallow riffles, and I came to this one very wild section of the river, which is still one of my favorite parts of the Housatonic, and it's the point where the 10-mile river empties into the Housatonic. I believe this was called Scatacoke, meaning the place where two rivers converge. And traditionally, this is said to be where the Native Americans came from the west and moved into this section of Connecticut through this valley formed by the 10-mile river. It's really the only break in this mountain ridge for quite a while. And I believe that as the white settlers kind of disrupted the Native Americans' way of life, a lot of them left through this same corridor. I did nose into the 10-mile river, but it was too shallow at the time. So you can see the boat handles these rapids going upstream really well. Going downstream is another story. Going upstream, pretty much at full throttle, on plane, the boat will plane roughly around 11-12 miles an hour with a top speed of about 20 miles an hour. Going upstream, when you're going against the current, it gives you a little bit more reaction time to avoid rocks. You can see how I'm slaloming through. If I hit one of these big rocks, it could damage the intake of the outboard. In fact, I've hit rocks so hard that the outboard lifted out of the boat and actually sheared off the stops off the aluminum frame. The sheared off stops that fell under the airfloor of the boat and almost punctured the airfloor. So this type of boating can be very violent and harsh on the equipment if your reaction time is a little too slow. Because going downstream, you're going with the current. You still have to go fast to stay on plane. If you go too slow, you might as well just shut off the engine and get a paddle and start paddling, which I had to do many, many times after hitting big rocks. but you could always paddle back downstream, find a deeper pool of water to get on plane, and turn around and head back up. And that's exactly what I did several times in this area to overcome these rapids. I made it to a really rough set of rapids that I didn't attempt in the boat. I know that just after this is Bull's Bridge, and there's some even more challenging rapids, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to get too much farther, so this was my ending point for this section of the river. But in this process, I learned a tremendous amount about navigating rivers like the Housatonic, and I really kind of dialed in the boat so that it would work in this situation. Ended up being very happy with the Kaboat. Some of the modifications I made to it included raising the transom so that the jet intake was roughly level with the bottom of the tubes. I did have to bring that down a little bit because it was cavitating and drawing in air because it was a little bit too close to the surface. So the bottom of the intake is still an inch or so below the bottom of the tubes. I also had to stiffen the transom with these rods that run from the transom to the oar locks because the transom would flex so much under the weight of this 25 horsepower outboard that I thought that I was going to damage the boat when I would hit these rocks. I did put together a toolkit in case I needed to repair the motor, including a spark plug wrench to change out spark plugs, some extra points and condensers. Also, very importantly, the tools to remove the intake if I hit a rock and shatter the aluminum intake, and a spare intake as well so that I could keep going. If the intake was broken, the boat would be dead in the water. So these are some spare parts that I considered essential. So in the next video, we'll see more of the Housatonic River in northern Connecticut. We'll go into Massachusetts. We'll encounter more hardships. We'll talk about more history of the river, starting in 1676 with a military operation led by Talcott, up to what is today Great Barrington, which was called the Great Wigwam at that time. We'll talk about the Dutch in the patent of Westenhoek, and we'll really put this boat to the test. So be sure to find out how we do in the jet boat in the next episode of the Housatonic River from Sea to Source.